May 1945, Bavaria, Germany. The war in Europe had been over for 4 days. An American prisoner of war camp held 1,100 German soldiers in a series of wire enclosures on the edge of a flattened field. The morning roll call was a routine event. American guards moved down the lines. German prisoners stood at varying degrees of compliance. Most were simply tired men who wanted to go home. Then Patton arrived for an inspection. He walked the line. He stopped in front of a German sergeant. The sergeant looked at him. He raised his right hand to his temple in what was technically a salute. 2 fingers, extended casually, barely lifted. The gesture a man makes when he means the opposite of what the gesture is supposed to mean. It was contempt, wearing the uniform of compliance. It was a provocation designed to be just small enough to deny. Patton saw it. He understood it immediately and completely. What he did next took 11 minutes and left 1,100 men standing in a field with nothing to think about, except what they had just witnessed. Sergeant First Class Daniel Pruitt was 26 years old. He came from Savannah, Georgia, where his father managed a hardware warehouse, and his mother sang in a church choir every Sunday, without exception, including the Sunday after his father's funeral. He had enlisted in 1941 and spent 4 years moving through North Africa, Sicily, and the length of Europe, with the steady endurance of a man who had decided early that complaining was a waste of energy that could be spent surviving. He was not a complicated soldier. He was thorough, fair, and possessed of the particular gift of noticing things that other people decided not to notice. He had been running morning roll calls at the camp for 9 days and had developed a precise understanding of the population, who was compliant, who was sullen, who was calculating, and who was performing. He knew Feldwebel Gerhard Metz by the 3rd day. Metz was performing. Pruitt had been watching him perform for 6 days and had been trying to decide at what point a performance became a violation worth reporting. The morning Patton arrived for his inspection, Pruitt was standing 8 feet to Patton's left when the 2-fingered salute happened. He saw it. He saw Patton see it. He watched what came next with the attention of a man who is learning something he will think about for the rest of his life. Feldwebel Gerhard Metz was 38 years old. He had served in the Wehrmacht for 16 years, long enough to have built his entire identity around the structure of military hierarchy and the particular pride of a career non-commissioned officer who had risen through demonstrated competence rather than politics or family connection. The surrender of Germany had not simply ended a war for Metz. It had ended the only world in which he knew who he was. He was not a fanatic. He was not a true believer in the Nazi ideology in any documented sense. He was something more ordinary, and in some ways more resistant, a man whose self-respect was entirely organized around a uniform that had just been stripped of its meaning. He had been processing this fact for 4 days with the specific bitterness of someone who has lost not just a cause, but a framework. The 2-fingered salute was not a political statement. It was a personal one. It said, "I am still here. I have not become what you want me to be. I am doing what you require and nothing more, and the distance between compliance and respect is exactly as wide as these 2 fingers." He had calculated that the Americans were in a generous mood, that the war being over meant consequences were softening, that a small gesture could be denied if challenged. He had miscalculated on every count. By May 1945, the Allied occupation of Germany was confronting a problem that no military manual had fully anticipated: the management of an enormous defeated army whose members ranged from the genuinely repentant to the quietly defiant to the openly contemptuous, all within the same wire enclosures. The prisoner of war camps were not combat situations. They were administrative ones. But they carried their own dangers, not of violence, but of the slow erosion of authority that happens when small defiances go unanswered. American camp commanders had been wrestling with the question of tone since the surrender. Too harsh, and they risked creating martyrs and international incidents in a post-war world already scrutinizing American conduct. Too lenient, and they risked establishing a culture of managed contempt that would make the occupation progressively harder to administer. Patton had opinions about this balance that were clear and consistent. He believed that the moment after a war ended was precisely when the establishment of authority mattered most, because it set the terms of everything that followed. He had been visiting camps across his sector for 3 days. He had been watching for exactly the kind of test that Metz had just provided. Before we go any further, before we get to what Patton did in those 11 minutes, and what 1,100 German prisoners watched happen in that field, make sure you subscribe. This channel tells the stories that the history books reduce to a footnote. Subscribe now, and we'll go back to Bavaria. Patton stopped walking. He stood in front of Metz. He looked at the 2 fingers still hovering near the man's temple. He looked at Metz's face. Metz met his gaze with the flat expression of a man who has decided his gesture is deniable and is waiting to see if it will be denied. Patton said nothing for 4 seconds. He looked at Metz the way he looked at terrain, systematically, without hurry, finding the thing that told him everything he needed to know. Then he turned to Pruitt. He said, "Sergeant, do you know the proper form of a military salute, as required by the regulations of this camp?" Pruitt said, "Yes, sir." Patton said, "Demonstrate it." Pruitt snapped his right hand to his temple, crisp, sharp, elbow level, fingers together, the full correct form. Patton said, "Thank you." He turned back to Metz. He said, through the interpreter standing at his left, "This man has just shown you what a salute looks like. I want you to do it correctly. Now." Metz looked at Patton. He looked at the interpreter. He raised his hand again. It was marginally better. 3 fingers this time, slightly crisper. But it was still a performance of compliance rather than compliance itself. Patton watched it. He said nothing for a moment. Then he turned to the camp commander, Lieutenant Colonel Harris, who was standing 6 feet to his right. He said, "Assemble the compound." What followed had a quality that every man present would struggle to describe accurately for the rest of their lives. It was not dramatic in the conventional sense. There was no shouting. There was no punishment in the physical meaning of the word. What Patton did was slower and more deliberate than any of that, and it landed with a weight that fast anger never could. All 1,100 prisoners were brought out of their enclosures and assembled in the main field. It took 22 minutes to move everyone into position. Patton stood at the edge of the field and waited. He did not look impatient. He did not look angry. He looked like a man with time, which in the context of the situation was the most unsettling thing he could have looked like. When the assembly was complete, he walked to the center of the field. He stood in front of Metz, who had been placed at the front of the formation. He looked at Metz. He looked at the 1,100 men behind him. Then he said, through the interpreter, loudly enough for the front rows to hear clearly, and for the words to carry back through the formation in the silence of the May morning, "This man is going to show you what a salute looks like. He's going to do it correctly. He's going to keep doing it until it is correct. You are all going to watch. We have time." Metz stood in front of 1,100 of his fellow prisoners and raised his hand to his temple. Patton looked at it. He said, "Again." Metz did it again. Patton said, "Again." The 3rd time was better. Patton said, "Again." By the 5th repetition, the 2-fingered gesture was gone. By the 8th repetition, the salute was technically correct. By the 11th, it was crisp. Patton looked at it for a moment. He said, "That is a salute." Then he turned and walked off the field. The entire exercise had taken 11 minutes from the first again to the last. 1,100 men had stood in a field, and watched a sergeant practice a salute until he got it right. There had been no cruelty in it. There had been no humiliation in the conventional sense. No one had been struck. No one had been degraded. No uniform had been torn. What there had been was visibility. Metz had made his gesture in front of 8 people. Patton had returned it in front of 1,100. The mathematics of that exchange were perfectly clear to every man standing in the field, and they remained perfectly clear for the duration of the camp's operation. Pruitt told the story once to his son in 1979. He said, "I have seen men get angry in the Army my whole career. I have seen men get loud. I have seen men get cruel. What I saw that morning was none of those things. He just made the man do it right in front of everybody. And then he left. And nobody in that camp tested the rules again. Not once. His son asked what the difference was between that and humiliation." Pruitt thought about it for a moment. He said, "Humiliation is when you make a man feel small for what he is. What Patton did was make a man do correctly what he had done wrong. There is a difference. I am not certain everyone could see it. But I could." Feldwebel Gerhard Metz was repatriated in August 1945. He returned to his hometown of Augsburg, where his family had lived for 3 generations. He worked for 22 years as a foreman in a machine parts factory, a role that required him to maintain discipline and standard across a production floor, to notice when something was done incorrectly, and to require it be done again until it was right. A colleague who worked alongside him for 11 years said that Metz ran the production floor with the specific patience of a man who never raised his voice and never accepted less than the correct form. The colleague said he once asked Metz where he learned to manage people that way. Metz said, "From an American general of all places." He did not explain further. Patton wrote about the morning in a letter to Beatrice dated May 11th, 1945. He wrote, "I visited a prisoner camp today, and a German sergeant gave me a 2-fingered salute. I made him do it correctly in front of everyone. It took 11 attempts. The 11th was correct, and I accepted it, and left. I have been thinking about what the correct response to contempt is, and I believe it is not anger, and it is not punishment. It is insistence. You insist on the correct form until the correct form is produced, and then you leave. The man learns that contempt is more exhausting than compliance, and everyone who watched learns the same thing without being told." Some historians have argued that Patton's response was itself a form of theater, that assembling 1,100 prisoners to watch a man practice a salute was a public spectacle designed to satisfy his personal need for dominance rather than any genuine administrative necessity. They contend that a private correction would have served the same purpose at a fraction of the cost in time and energy, and that the assembly was about Patton's ego as much as about the camp's discipline. Others argue the opposite, that the public nature of the correction was precisely what gave it its administrative value, that a private correction would have been a secret, and that what the camp needed was not a secret lesson, but a visible one, observed by every man in the compound, so that the standard was established, not for one sergeant, but for everyone watching. They argue that Patton understood the difference between punishing a man and teaching a compound, and that what he chose was the latter. What is certain is that 1,100 men stood in a field in Bavaria in May 1945 and watched a sergeant do a salute 11 times, and that for the remainder of the camp's operation, the roll calls were correct. If you had been in Patton's position that morning, if you had seen that 2-fingered gesture and understood exactly what it meant, would you have assembled the compound? Or would you have found a quieter way, a more private correction, a way that didn't require 1,100 men to stand in a field and watch? Tell us in the comments. And if you want more stories about the general who won the war and paid for it with everything he had, stories that don't give you easy answers, subscribe. We'll be here.